The state of modern technology is reaching scary new heights. It's like 1984. I get things like business reviews, but when Yelp starts doing things like reviews on average people, it starts to become a bit scary, like China's social credit system. Such as this one on me as a person, for instance. Brett H. says, I was sitting next to Daniel Natal on the bus, and his breath smelled really bad, like tuna hole. Or Connor M., who comments, I was at a stoplight eating my bagel in the morning, and then I looked over and saw him in the car next to me. He was picking his nose when he thought nobody was looking. Or Chris P., who adds, he's not as smart as he thinks he is. Okay, maybe Yelp reviews of individual human beings is not such a good idea. Although, to be fair, Heaven probably has something similar. But you guys are no angels. I mean, if you people are going to be as picky and temperamental as this, I'm going to have more of a headwind against me in bringing you The Daniel Natal Show. We keep hearing a lot in the media about inequality. It's being used as an excuse to trigger the Great Reset and curtail all our freedoms, in the name of creating a more equitable system, one where you will own nothing and be happy, according to the World Economic Forum. Alexis de Tocqueville visited America at the beginning of the Republic in the 1820s and commented, amongst the novel objects that attracted my attention during my stay in the United States, nothing struck me more forcibly than the general equality of conditions. Thomas Malthus in the 1790s commented, but the English North American colonies, now the powerful people of the United States of America, made by far the most rapid progress. To the plenty of good land which they possessed in common with the Spanish and Portuguese settlements, they added a greater degree of liberty and equality. Malthus was also impressed that as English workers starved, American workers got to keep a lion's share of their own income, hence enjoying a prosperity unknown in Europe. Economist Henry George says that the average American worker made 2 to 3 times what his European counterpart did. He attributed this to America's lack of a land baron class, an aristocracy. As we've discussed before, price is composed of 3 elements: the cost of capital, the cost of labor, and the cost of rent. After the Industrial Revolution, when the old aristocracy saw all these commoners getting rich by making new inventions, they got scared about losing ground and hemorrhaging power. They weren't creative, so they couldn't get on board with the Industrial Revolution by coming up with new products. They weren't industrious or prone to hard work, but they did have one thing: land. So they decided to get rich by jacking up land prices outside of market forces. This increased the prices of rent, which made everything more expensive. It got so bad that around the 1790s it cost the average worker a week's wages to buy a loaf of bread. This led to mass starvation and to the Poor Laws in England, which enacted the birth of the welfare state. In America, by contrast, where land was cheap and there was no aristocracy to jack up the prices, everything was less expensive. According to Henry George, the money that wasn't wasted on exorbitant rents went into what he called the wage fund, which is why workers got paid more in America. Land was plentiful in America, but workers weren't. So to attract more workers, they offered higher salaries. The lack of a land baron class in America fostered a vastly more equal and more prosperous society. None other than Karl Marx himself looked over at America admiringly, seeing what would happen with no oligarchs. He wanted that for Europe. But now we're in a time period where America finally has acquired an aristocracy, and we're watching as they do to us what they once did to Europe. Kate Raworth in Donut Economics wrote, between 1988 and 2008, the majority of countries worldwide saw rising inequality within their borders, resulting in a hollowing out of their middle classes. In The Broken Ladder by Keith Payne, he points out that the more homogeneous a country is, the less income inequality there is, whereas the more demographically diverse a country is, the wider the income gap. In short, we're importing poverty into the West from the Third World. To return to Kate Raworth, she says, higher levels of national inequality, it turns out, also tend to go hand in hand with increased ecological degradation. Why so? Because inequality erodes social capital, built on community connection, trusts, and norms that underpins the collective action needed to demand, enact, and enforce environmental legislation. Here she's making much the same point as social scientist Robert Putnam in his book, Bowling Alone: The Collapse and Revival of American Community. As a liberal, he hid his data for 10 years because he feared that it demonstrated how greater diversity causes social fragmentation, as different demographic groups tribalize and social trust erodes as society balkanizes. Of course, our wise corporate overlords in their infinite wisdom don't care about this. They just want to keep importing poverty, crime, and social fragmentation. To pay for these poor, we're taxing the middle class into non-existence to defray the costs, such as New York, where they're giving foreigners in the country illegally $1,500 a pop. Or in Oakland, California, where the mayor decided to channel taxes into paying for universal basic income for people, but only if you're non-white. In the book Nudge by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, they write, Kammerer calls for asymmetric paternalism, which he defines as taking steps to help the least sophisticated people while imposing minimal harm on everyone else. Harm? So they admit that their policy causes harm? Of course, what this is a scheme to import large numbers of new workers, and instead of having the corporations who are driving the policy pay for it, the cost is being offloaded onto the taxpayer. Such schemes would be impossible without the active collusion between the corporate sector and politicians, something that the economist Adam Smith warned about as far back as 1776. He wrote in Chapter 8 of The Wealth of Nations, "But whoever imagines upon this account that masters rarely combine is as ignorant of the world as of the subject." In other words, if you don't believe that oligarchs engage in conspiracies, one is demonstrating one's naivete and ignorance. One of the chief nodes between the corruption are central banks, who seek to maximize profits by lowering labor costs. How are costs lowered in any industry? The answer? Surpluses. With the commonness of a thing, the value goes down. This basic law of supply and demand is why dirt is cheap and gold is precious. Labor is no different. As you increase the labor pool, you diminish the market value of said labor, which is why the Central Bank of Ireland got caught admitting that they were flooding the country with migrants to lower wages across the board for everyone. As outlined in the Independence article, not enough migrants arriving to keep pay down Central Bank of Ireland. What we're watching is the collapse of the middle class by a new oligarchical class, whose very policies are causing the inequality by importing it. Left alone, our society was the most equal in human history, a model that the rest of the world admired. But now, ironically, the very oligarchs who are importing the third world and causing inequality are the very ones now saying that they need more power in the Great Reset to address the very inequality that they caused. Kind of like Kate Raworth complaining in her book that the top 1% of the planet owns 50% of global wealth. Her solution to the problem? Giving the richest 1% 100% of global wealth, to be redistributed at their leisure and according to their whim. Remember, while you're being told that you will own nothing and be happy, the oligarchs are not being asked to relinquish their wealth. Now be a good serf, and maybe they'll be good enough to grant you subsistence-level crumbs. People fear any political leader who has his finger on the red button. What political leaders fear is people having their finger on the red button, the subscribe button. Push it and see their narratives explode. Also consider donating to help keep these videos coming, and don't forget our website and newsletter, thenewamerican.com.